So the Halloween season is coming to a close this year, but I figured I'd review one more anime movie before it's over. That movie of course being Vampire Hunter D. So Vampire Hunter D opens up with this girl, Doris Lang, making her rounds when she and her horse are attacked and she is bitten by Count Magnus Lee, a vampire. Now infected and desperate for help, Doris finds a vampire hunter named D. She tests his strength and he easily overcomes her. She apologizes and explains the situation. Dee sees her bite mark and decides to help her. When they get into the town, the mayor's son Greco-Roman finds out about Doris' situation, and he says he won't blab if he marries her. But Doris just immediately kicks his ass, so Gecko just blabs anyway, forcing Doris to be confronted by the mayor in town. The town wants to put her into an asylum to protect themselves. However, Dee wants them to hold it off until he can kill the Count, which will cure Doris' vampirism. So Dee, Doris, and her brother decide to wait the night at her place for the Count's henchmen to arrive. The two who arrive are Rei Ginsei, Count Lee's servant, and Lee's daughter Lamika. They demand Dee give her to them, but of course Dee isn't budging, so it leads to a fight. After they clash, Dee gets injured, but he recovers pretty quickly, revealing himself to be a Dhampir, a half-vampire, half-human hybrid. Dee tells the two to leave with a warning to the Count. They decide to leave, and the next day, Dee decides to enter Count Lee's castle and bring an end to him once and for all. So Vampire Hunter D was directed by Tuya Ashida, with the story being based off the same name by Hideyuki Kikuchi. Kind of funny how all these movies I reviewed during the Halloween season all ended up being stories by him. Though at least this time the movie wasn't directed by Yoshiaki Kawajiri, so this is a pretty fun horror flick. This is a world set far in the future, oddly enough. There are laser guns and TV sets, but everyone dresses like they're from the 1800s, and they ride horses. It's a very interesting world that Vampire Hunter D takes place in. I also really like the monster designs in this. They're so varied and interesting, they could have easily just made generic looking creatures, but the filmmakers went the extra mile in making them all unique. I also really like the fight scenes in this film. One that pops up in my mind is when Dee is fighting through the Count's castle. He is holding Doris in one arm while slashing through enemies with his sword in the other. It's just a cool rush of adrenaline you feel seeing Dee run through all these monsters in a flash. Now let's talk about some of our characters. Dee, our main protagonist, is a Dhampir. He is strong, fast, and can basically slice through these demons with his sword like butter. Dee is quiet and he doesn't speak too much. But in truth, Dee does this to prevent getting too close to people. However, Dee still cares about people. When he learns of Doris' condition, he immediately decides to help her without a second thought. And when Doris' brother finds out about Doris being bit, Dee gives him a pep talk about how he needs to support his sister in her time of need. So we see the humanity inside Dee at various points in the story. Also, I need to talk about Dee's left hand. His left hand can speak to Dee. He's very snarky, and he comments on the situations at hand. We aren't really given an explanation about what it is, it's just a part of Dee that likes to talk. It gets a scene where Dee gets his left hand cut off, and he's incapacitated, forcing the hand to reattach itself and eat the dirt off the ground to regain energy. It's a little weird, but it's kind of funny also seeing this hand have to resuscitate Dee before he gets killed. Now I'll talk about Doris, our heroine of the story. She is tough and no nonsense. She is so desperate to stop her vampirism and protect her brother. We see she is a hunter herself armed with a gun. Unfortunately, the things she fights happen to be much stronger than her, so she has to rely on Dee most of the time to save her. She ends up developing a crush on Dee, but Dee can't reciprocate because it will cause him to give in to his vampiric urges and bite her, much to her dismay. So yeah, pretty cool character, but unfortunately hard for her to fight when she's up against monsters stronger than her. But hey, she gets a cool gun at least. Then we have Rei. Rei is one of the henchmen the Count hires to kidnap Doris and kill Dee. Rei has this cool ass power where he can manipulate the space between his opponents and make them end up hitting themselves instead. It totally feels like a fight from JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. It turns what could be a simple fight into a unique situation Dee has to overcome. I wish the film took advantage of it more though, because it's really only used in one fight. Anyway, he's a cool recurring bad guy Dee has to fight. Next we have Lamika, the Count's daughter. I think Lamika's a good character because we really get to see her change throughout the story. Lamika hates Doris with a passion. She doesn't want her father to wed Doris because it will pollute their bloodline. However, as she finds out Doris doesn't want to marry her father, she starts to question him more, and she learns that her mother was a human, meaning she is a Dhampir herself like Dee. This causes her to turn on her father, but of course she isn't very strong, so she gets taken out pretty quickly. Finally, we have our main bad guy, Count Magnus. The reason the Count wants Doris is because he's an immortal vampire who's grown bored. And the only way to alleviate that boredom is of course to turn Doris into his plaything until he disposes of her. The Count is just plain evil, and he does a good job displaying it. He really doesn't care for Ray, denying him the immortality he wanted. He doesn't care what his daughter thinks about marrying Doris either. A showdown takes place between the Count and Dee, but in the end, Dee is able to overpower the Count by reminding him that Dee is the son of Count Dracula himself. The Count ends up dying, causing his castle to collapse. A fitting end to a great bad guy. So Vampire Hunter D is pretty great. The film is like if you made an anime version of Castlevania. Or, at least until Netflix made one. Anyway, the animation is great in the film, the fight scenes are cool, and the characters are real likable and fun. I definitely recommend checking this out if you want something a little different this Halloween season.